So there's some common mistakes that I see frequently in the discussion section, and they are some ways that you should not begin your discussion section. The first of these is by writing a second introduction. I see that sometimes, and I've actually made that mistake myself in the past before I learned a lot about scientific writing and what to do and what not to do. If you need to bring in more material that you didn't introduce before, sometimes that happens, but you need to work it into the discussion at the appropriate place. You don't need a whole second introduction paragraph. Now, if you find that you have that second introduction, maybe you should move it into the real introduction. Or maybe it's just not relevant and you're just trying to find a way to get started. So a better way to get started would be by revisiting the research question and why you're asking it. And that's going to build up the momentum to answer the research question. But don't start with a second introduction. Also, don't start by summarizing the results. Okay, the readers just finished reading the results section. They don't need to read a summary of what they just read. Avoid that mistake too. Continuing on the organization of the discussion section, in the last paragraph, this is where you're going to have the conclusions, significance, and future directions. Now, as always, signpost the important elements or the important points that you're making. And for the conclusions paragraph, just start with the words "in conclusion." Make it easy for the readers to see that you're now wrapping it up and you're going to talk about some conclusions. It might be helpful in this paragraph to again restate the research question, but don't state it word for word. Paraphrase it and make it sound a little bit differently. And reiterate the significance of your work in the bigger picture in this paragraph. But you're not repeating what you've said previously. This should be a forward-looking paragraph, right? So you're looking towards the future. You're telling the readers what all this means in terms of going forward. So part of that is going to be saying what we need to do next. Now that you've done this work and you found some new knowledge gaps, next you need to address those knowledge gaps. That's an important thing to talk about in this conclusions paragraph. And end with a forward-looking final sentence. So how do you not end the discussion section? Well, don't write a summary. So a conclusions paragraph and a summary paragraph are quite different. The conclusions paragraph is looking forward. It's interpreting, it's building knowledge. And a summary paragraph is just repeating what you've already said. And it's not necessary to summarize. Don't end your section with a statement that just says further research is needed. That's not very interesting and it's not very informative. Of course, further research is needed. The research process is never going to end. We're always going to be discovering new things. Tell what further research is needed and why that further research is needed. And word it in a way that's more exciting than just saying further research is needed. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what if I need to write a combined results and discussion section? How do I do that? Well, we're not going to go into a lot of details about how to do that because the techniques are quite similar. And a combined results and discussion section is the norm in some journals. And it's optional in other journals, and some journals don't like it and they don't allow the combined results and discussion section. But for certain types of studies, the combined results and discussion section can be easier to write and it's easier for readers. So, for example, when I've written papers on functional genomics, like RNA transcript profiling, I found those papers easier to write and easier for readers if I do a combined results and discussion section rather than just a separate results and a separate discussion. The drawback with doing this is it's harder to incorporate all of the key components that you need in a discussion because the discussion is really focused on those specific exact results. And it's harder to work in the comparison and the contrast, and it's harder to find a good place to put the critical assessment of your study. You can do it, but you have to work a little bit harder to figure out how to do that. So if you do need to write a combined results and discussion section, what I suggest you do is to write the results section and then come back in and add the discussion to that results section. That has worked for me in the past. Now you could write try to write them simultaneously. That might work for you. So if you do need to write a combined R&D, figure out what works for you. Now that you know how to structure your discussion section, you can avoid some of the typical problems that I see in discussion sections. A big one that I see is that the answer to the research question is not in the first paragraph. It might be buried halfway through the paper, it might be in the final paragraph, or maybe they don't even answer it directly and they leave it up to the readers to puzzle everything together. So that's a big one that I see. Make sure you don't make that mistake. Also, a mistake I see is that the authors do not point out the importance or significance of the study. So that's going to have less impact in the minds of the readers. Another big one is that the authors do a lot of speculating. And what I mean by this is they're including a lot of thoughts about how things might work, and they're making connections to very distant studies that are kind of related, but they're not directly related to the research question of your particular study. And so they're trying to do too much. This is kind of like in the introduction where a person writes a literature review instead of a background that funnels. This is the opposite of that, where instead of discussing the results in a very focused manner, they let the discussion get too broad and they're expanding it to too many tangential items. And so this is an inclusion of irrelevant information. Now, it's relevant in the big picture, but it's not relevant to your study. What you can do to recognize this is look at your paragraphs. If none of your paragraphs are directly discussing any of your results, then that paragraph should be taken out. Another common mistake I see frequently is that the discussion is not really a discussion. It's just rehashing the results. It's repeating the results section, maybe with different wording, but it's basically just going over the results again. So make sure you're not just repeating the results, but you are doing comparisons and contrasts with previous studies, and in a specific way, not just saying our results are similar to the results of this previous study, but explain why they're similar, how they're similar, and what that means, why it matters in the context of your study. And so that's what I mean by that final bullet point, that previous work in the field is not truly discussed, it's only mentioned and cited. All right, it's time for your action list. This is a big one. This is a big list. The discussion section is a really tough one to write. But if you did a good job on the introduction, it's going to make it a lot easier because the introduction is going to give you a roadmap for how to write the discussion section. All right, so let's go over the list. First, you're going to write paragraph 1. You're going to write the answer to the research question and support that answer with specific results and cite the figures and tables that those results are coming from. Then you're going to write the middle paragraphs, and you will write about the other important points to be made about your results. So you should discuss all of your figures and tables. And for each key point that you're making about all of your results, show how it relates to what is known. In other words, the previously published studies. Compare and contrast. And discuss how each result relates to the knowledge gaps or to the research question. Also, you're going to work in a discussion of the strengths and limitations of your study. That might be a standalone paragraph, or you might work that into various parts of the discussion, but be sure you have that included. Discuss any unexpected findings and why they're important. Make sure you're comparing and contrasting with previous studies. And if your study finds a totally different or a substantially different outcome than a previous study, it's important to bring that up to the forefront and discuss how yours is different and maybe why yours is different. Maybe you did the procedures slightly differently than that previous study, and that had a big impact on the result. Or, maybe the previous study did something incorrectly, and you can discuss that. You don't want to attack the previous authors, but you do want to do a detailed analysis of why you might have these contradictory results. So you're not going to discuss that in the results section, it's going to come in the discussion section. If your paper allows you to develop a model to explain your findings, this is where that figure is going to happen in the discussion section. So go ahead and generate the figure and generate the paragraph discussing that model and explaining how it leads to new knowledge and new questions. Then in the final paragraph, you're going to write a conclusions paragraph. And also in that final paragraph, you're going to write about the significance of your findings, how they can be applied in your field, and then talk about what needs to be done next, the future directions. As we wrap up this lesson, let's take a look back at the learning outcomes. At the conclusion of this lesson, you will be able to explain the purpose of a discussion section. You'll be able to structure the discussion in a pyramid shape, going from specific information to general information. You will be able to discuss the findings of your study without repeating the results, and you will discuss your findings and prior related publications. Do the comparison and contrast with those previous publications. You will refer to the figures and tables as you bring them up in the discussion. You'll be able to discuss the significance of your study, and you'll be able to propose future directions. And finally, you will be able to avoid the common problems of the discussion section. That concludes this lesson on the discussion. You have a lot of work to do, so get started on that. Enjoy the process, and happy writing.